Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. Together we dive into the world of sci-fi and science fiction. From episodes of Star Trek, Star Wars, to The Walking Dead, Resident Evil, all the hot new science fiction movies from the back doors of Marvel or DC. The Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. You'll never look at science fiction the same way again.
Thank you for tuning in to the GSMC Sci-Fi Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Alex. Today we are talking about V-Wars Season 1, Episode 9. Our last episode ended off with Luther Swan being prepared to talk to the senatorial committee on something related to DNS having some overreach and putting people in internment camps and possibly also murdering Claire O'Hagan. Now, Luther had previously told Senator Sasha Giroux that he would go through with this and testify for her and gladly do so in order to prevent more people from dying. However, it looks like Calyx Niklos has a different idea, and just as Luther is about to testify, Niklos walks in with his ex-wife, Rachel, Luther's ex-wife, Rachel, and sits down with her and has an arm over her that's very clearly threatening because she looks also incredibly terrified. So Luther freezes like a deer in the headlights there for a moment. And they think that he's not going to say anything, and they go to take his time away, and then he decides to just go ahead and call them out on it. And he lets them know, hey, I'm scared right now that if I tell you guys the truth, they're going to kill my ex-wife. You see that guy back there? He is a really terrible person, and he is the head of this organization, and he is holding my wife hostage right now. And then he decides to go ahead and go all the way off about all of it. At least now people in the room are aware of Rachel's presence. It's not very likely that they're going to be able to kill her, at least while he is in the process of speaking, or even sneak her back out of there, because everyone, all the reporters and everyone are snapping all these pictures and everything of them. And that's where this episode opens, is right where the last one left off. And with Luther knowing the stakes are super high right now, and that all of these people are going to die if he does not go ahead and call them out now, that he can't let the fascism train keep on rolling past him when he knows where this is going to ultimately lead. And I'm really proud of Luther for coming out and saying something. I figured that he would, but there for a second, I was like, wow, is he really just going to walk out of there right now? That's a terrible idea. I mean, it's very kind and sweet towards his ex-wife. Don't get me wrong. You can have empathy in different directions. And I get why he was hesitant, because it's the mother of his child whose life is at stake and everything. But ultimately, if you're looking at it in the needs of the many outweighing the needs of the few, then this is something that was like, okay, well, maybe Luther is just going to let this ride there for a second. But I'm pleased that he went ahead and called them out. He just blew everything up, but I'm not entirely certain he was necessarily ready to blow all of that up. Not ready per se, but rather prepared. He's not as prepared as he could have been had Rachel not been captured. And I don't mean to place that blame on Rachel at all. She's done her best. She's already shot a federal agent. So she's doing a fantastic job so far. But since that is his weak spot, Luther's weak spot is always going to be people. That tends to be the hero's weak spot a ton of the time. So, since that is also the case for Luther Swan, he's going to go ahead and not throw her under the bus, but he is going to protect her and try to do the smart thing this time, because he knows he can't trust the government. Even if he does not speak the truth and just sits down, they will still have access to and custody of Rachel at the end of the hearing period. So that's not good either. So I think he makes the best decision that he ultimately can to ensure what he believes to be the best possible outcome. And it would be the best possible outcome if things were, more My Little Pony, I guess, on this show. However, it's not. So he just goes off and he's like, hey, they have people in internment camps. They are putting specifically the vampires in there, but also a lot of people who've just been exposed, and not even everyone's going to turn. And of course, the senatorial floor just erupts. People are all yelling over top of each other, silence, or let him finish, or that's slander, or just the general uproar of everyone who's in the audience. As we've seen from some recent Senate Judiciary Committee meetings and confirmation meetings in the past 4 to 5 years, sometimes there are even celebrities like Alyssa Milano in those seats, or family members of individuals, or just folks who wanted to be present for the hearing. Sometimes you can go and see a lot of different types of hearings and ongoings from your local representatives, especially at your capital. So if that's something you're interested in, you can definitely go check that out. But that's why you can also see some random people in there too. And this isn't really any different in V-Wars. There are a lot of folks whom we'll probably never meet. They're just folks who are there to watch history unfold, even if they're not necessarily reporting on it. And so the reporters start freaking out too. And everyone's freaking out in a different way. And meanwhile, Luther keeps yelling over top of everyone, or at least trying to, since he has access to a microphone, but so do the committee members. And he's pointing and yelling and making eye contact with Nikos, and is making sure that people are getting the real picture. And in the meantime, Michael and Ava are watching him on television. The vampires are seeing what he is having to say. And Mike sees this as an opportunity to really get the humans and the vampires to start getting along, or find some kind of truce. So Michael decides to use this as an opportunity and is trying to figure out how he wants to do that. And Ava is really starting to disagree with him a lot more in this part of the story. And Michael is like, look, we just need to wait for the right time and our moment will come to us. But she seems incredibly reluctant to do so. She's really fiery, and I mean, she's not only a vampire, but she's 19 years old, and she's told him that before. Hey, I'm only 19. Are you sure you want me to be your second in command and to do this stuff? And Michael makes her a second in command. Now, don't get me wrong, Ava is very intelligent and is a good second in command in a lot of ways. But she also tends to go off on her own little side missions sometimes. Like, she first starts out going, hey, no, Michael said we can't feed on humans outside of the designated feeding times or feeding parties. You can't be doing that, to, deciding, hey, you know what, I hate you, and I'm going to join in on this. She's very affected by her emotions in that way, and Ava is prone to having her feelings hurt and just manifesting that as anger a lot. And also, just anger in general. So that's forming more of a source of contention between her and Michael, not to mention Michael's relationship with Danica. So that's not going great, but it's going to maybe really help us out when it comes time to ask Michael to meet in order to come to terms. Michael is resistant up to this point in meeting with the humans to discuss any terms. He doesn't want to stop and talk to any of them right now or at all in the future, just period. He's not interested in the humans for the most part. But he does need to find a way to keep the vampires alive. Could really care less about most of the humans, but he wants to keep the vampires alive. So Senator Giroux, on the other hand, feels the same way about the humans, and she is treating the vampires like they are humans, just like she would any other constituent, for the most part, that is otherwise hostile. But she's really seeming to be a genuine person, and I like her a lot. So she is also going, hey, maybe now's the right time that we should be meeting for this. This is really important, and she tries to take advantage of the opportunity in a positive way to go through and arrange to meet with Michael Fane for the peace treaty. But Michael's like, no, I'm not dealing with senators. He doesn't like politicians, and Luther explains that to her. He's like, look, Michael did not like politicians or the government or trust them in any way prior to even becoming a vampire. Prior to having been hunted down by them and shot at by them in these situations of him following what he considers to be his new true nature. And he explains to her he's not going to trust politicians anymore now that they have frequently tried to kill him. Now the government has frequently tried to kill him and people who are like him and put them in cages. Why on earth would this person trust the government now? Even if they are saying they're offering a peace treaty, especially if they are offering a peace treaty. As far as he's concerned, it may just be a Trojan horse. So we know that he's not going to talk to Sasha, but Luther tries the same appeal that he had tried before with Claire O'Hagan. And he says, look, let me go and talk to him. I know where I can go and talk to him, and we can work on this, and I think that we can really come to terms. He is my brother. He's again referring to Luther as still being his brother, and he's like, look, this is just a difference of opinion, and I know that Michael's reasonable, and he doesn't want to hurt people, and that's all we really want, is for vampires to not hurt people. So let me go in and appeal to his better nature. He trusts me, he knows me, and even if he might still have some lingering anger with me for what I did before, I know that he'll still trust me. He will still trust me over you anyway. I may not be our ideal chance, but I am our current best chance, is what Luther is really trying to get across to her. And she's super hesitant. She's like, look, I mean, under what authority would you even do that? Why would you be qualified to have this conversation with him? You're not a trained negotiator. You are not associated with, trying to make sure people don't kill other people in any way. You're not even law enforcement, dude. She's saying, you are a scientist. You're not a political scientist even. You're like an epidemiologist. So why should you be able to negotiate on behalf of the U.S. government with these new species, people, this new group that we are facing? And he's like, that's a good point, but, right now it's more of an emotional intelligence type of thing than it is an intellectual intelligence. It's not about what Luther knows about the law. It's how well he knows Michael and Michael's heart and the approaches that would be most beneficial. And also, he's the person that Michael is least likely to kill. We've already seen, even when the wounds were really fresh from Luther having betrayed Michael to the cops regarding having killed that girl, and that resulted in Michael being picked up and taken in, and ultimately, using that guy's body to catch bullets and then also jump off of the stairs and cushion his blow in his superhero landing, or super villain, anti-hero landing. But we got to see that earlier because Luther had betrayed his brother. And even when he was super upset about it, though, when Luther went to go see him right after Claire O'Hagan had approved the same move that Sasha is about to approve, Michael still didn't hurt him, even when the wound was super fresh. So he's even less likely to harm him now, at least in my opinion. It makes sense. And he is ultimately successful in his appeal to Sasha regarding going to see Michael, but she does make some stipulations for them. We're going to go on a quick break, and when we come back, we are going to talk about some of those stipulations and how this actually pans out as our heroes try to reach a truce.
Want to find out what movies to go see? Then check out the GSMC Movie Podcast. It's your ticket to the latest movies, whether it's a new blockbuster event, romantic, comedy, or action flick. This show has got it all covered. They talk some what to go see now. Don't bother. What's hot on Netflix and everything in between. That's gsmcpodcast.com/movie-podcast. When it's all about the movies, it has to be this new show. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit gsmcpodcast.com for more info.
Welcome back. Before the break, we were talking about where we left off in episode 8 of season 1 of V-Wars and where season 9 starts with Luther filleting the DNS on the floor of this Senate committee hearing. It's very clear where he stands on this, and he calls them all the way out. In the meantime, Michael and Ava have been arguing about whether now is the time to strike or if they need to wait longer. And Michael has ultimately decided to meet with Senator Sasha Giroux, who is Luther's friend. But not Sasha herself, her representative in the form of Luther Swan. So Luther is the only person Michael is willing to speak with, and he wants assurances that Michael is able to do what he's supposed to do. Ava and Danica end up in a little hissy contest with each other regarding who should get to go with Michael on this momentous event, even if neither of them are necessarily keen on a truce with the humans. But they are also posturing their dominance over each other. And ultimately, Michael chooses neither of them. He takes Kaylee Vo with him instead. Kaylee has so far proved to be a valuable ally. She has also proven to be a super genuinely helpful one who really has the same type of mission that they do. She also wants DNS taken down. So even though she's not a blood herself, he does feel some sort of a kinship with Kaylee. I mean, also, he could easily kill her like that. It would not be hard for Michael to do that, or any of the vampires to do that, for that matter. But Kaylee appears to have Michael's protection within Blood Nation. They know, since she was on camera too, for the video that she released, the propaganda, that she's involved, since she has also exposed herself as being the head of Verdilak. So Kaylee goes with him, and as he explains to the other two, also pragmatically, I'm strong enough to handle this, but she is human, so she also functions as a hostage. She's on our side, but she also functions as a hostage. And this doesn't really actually seem to upset Kaylee all that much, which I think is really funny. She's standing right there. She can hear them. But she's like, yeah, that makes sense. Let's go and get this done. And that's one of the things that I like about Kaylee. On the other hand, Luther also gets to bring one person with him, and he brings Jimmy Saint. So Jimmy is assigned to Luther's safety, but Jimmy also doesn't seem super concerned about what is going on here with Michael either. Jimmy doesn't seem to have any prejudice against Michael or vampires, is what I'm saying. I think that Jimmy has seen enough of the evil of humanity that for him this is largely not all that different. He has been through it recently with the motorcycle club and, Bobby really struggling to hold on to the last of the stability that he had going on beforehand in the midst of what was definitely some addiction problems, but what also seemed to possibly be some untreated or mistreated type of mental health issues. And I'm not sure what the appropriate term would be, but I say mistreated in case he was self-medicating for something else by taking these drugs to help him forget or to help him try to escape some sort of pain. I'm not really trying to set Bobby up as a sympathetic character here. What I am saying is that there are reasons often that people go awry, and sometimes that's trauma. And in the case of Bobby, I think that it seems that there may be more going on with that character than just him being mean. Now, maybe he is just mean, but most of the time I find that people are the way that they are for a reason. That doesn't exempt them from attempting personal growth or, from needing to try to be a better person, but it does help us understand things. And those types of situations are partly why I always tell y'all that I care a lot more interested rather, in the motivations behind villains than I am behind heroes a lot of the time. Unless they're like an anti-hero. I want to know more than just, oh, this is a good person, so they do good because they are good, or they are good because they do good. Because that sets up this situation of, this person's evil just because they do bad things. They could stop at any time, and they choose not to just because they're evil. It's a kind of circular logic that I don't really enjoy because it's a little bit boring. And let's face it, humans are more complex than that. And that is what the show's partly about. And it's also what Jimmy is recognizing when he's accompanying Luther to this meeting. He knows that humans are complex and they can be really kind and they can be really terrible and everywhere in between. And that just because someone has some different genes doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be any better or any worse to you. Anyone can kill, and Jimmy seems reluctant to just place that blanket statement on them. Jimmy can also really handle himself. He has come face to face with Danica before, although Michael and Jimmy are not aware that they both know this same person. At least, I don't think so, unless maybe Jimmy caught that commercial and put two and two together. I don't know, it was dark, and he was out in the woods chasing him after Bobby told him to, while they were still threatening Luther's life, back in, episode 5, 6, 7, something like that. You guys know what I'm talking about. So, Jimmy has had contact with vampires before. He has also seen humans murder people just because they were afraid. And that's Jimmy's whole thing, is he's not down with just killing out of fear. And he is someone who's prepared for this. He knows he can handle himself. And so because he's not straight up always afraid, and he is in fact prepared, he is more confident and comfortable, just as Kaylee is. Kaylee understands her part in all of this, too, and is totally fine with the fact that she is there to protect Michael by being a hostage, really, even as Jimmy is there to protect Luther in a different capacity, in more of a physical capacity, instead of, preying on someone's reluctance to harm an otherwise innocent bystander. After all, Kaylee is essentially functioning as like press in a war zone. This isn't an officially declared war per se, but that is what Kaylee is doing, and so they are recognizing her place in this and getting the word out. And Luther is also a non-combatant who is still involved in the war efforts. He is just working on the scientific portion of it, and so he and Kaylee have a lot of that in common too. I like that we get to see these different intersections between these characters, and I wasn't expecting to see Luther and Kaylee together again anytime soon necessarily, but I really like that out of everyone that Michael and Luther could have chosen to go to this meeting, they picked Jimmy and Kaylee. It makes for a really interesting dynamic, and it's also broadening and deepening our understanding of who these characters are and who the show is, or what the show is really about, by getting these more complex relationships. They know each other on an individual basis now and can decide for themselves how much they like this other person, instead of them just being, oh, that person that was mentioned by Michael, or that lady who interviewed my ex-wife and gave me a really hard time when I really didn't need it back then. They are actually getting to know them, and I like how it's really broadening the web of this show. It feels enriching, I guess. That's the word that I'm looking for. And I feel like I'm getting a sort of payoff by seeing these characters introduced to each other and crossing paths at this time in the story. I know a lot of folks felt that with this part of the season, we just had a bunch of more things, of more plot threads and everything pop up. A lot of questions and stuff pop up, and possibilities arise than what folks would expect for the penultimate episode of a series, or a season at least. So season 1 of V-Wars has a reasonable sense of closure to it, to that story arc, but I want you to think of it going in as being more like Walking Dead, where you are going to perhaps see the end of a story arc, but you might also have some sort of cliffhanger involved in it. Something that you already can tell looking ahead where this story is likely to go. Kind of like the cache on your computer going, you know, if this then that, this is what has been selected before, this is what happened, so this may also happen. It's not just a dead end where you're getting to that one page and that's as far as you're ever going to go in that single session. So I really like the approach. I know a lot of folks, especially now with the binging type of culture we're in, folks really want to get that sense of closure within the first season, because you may have to wait a year or more for your next season. And I get why that can be really frustrating. But let me remind you, we waited like 2 years or something for the Game of Thrones final season. Now that may be a bad example, because a lot of people still had problems with that. But also, that's an ending, not a beginning or a simple continuation. And we knew for the longest time that that was, in fact, going to be the ending. And that makes it a little bit different from the V-Wars Season 2 arrival. Granted, we aren't currently slated to get a Season 2, which I have already previously lamented heavily, I think especially in the last episode. But we are, getting to see more in the graphic novels. So let's take a look at those and explore the world differently that way. And maybe if we hold out hope, it will get revived like The Expanse or something. But I digress. My point is that it's okay, in my opinion, that we don't get everything tied up this season. I grew up on CBS dramas, as I've discussed JAG with you guys before, and oftentimes we would have these really big cliffhangers at the ends of these procedural dramas. And then you would have to wait for months, because your last episode would be in like late April, early to mid-May. And then the new one wouldn't start until school started again in like September. And it would feel interminable, because when you're a kid and you're on summer break, you don't really have a sense of when things are going to end. You don't have any more structure, and so time flows really strangely for you. Time is such a nebulous thing when you're a kid, and because you can't conceptualize an end to it, you feel like it takes forever. Just like when you are going to a new destination, and it always feels a lot longer to get there than it does to return, even if the trip is exactly the same amount of time. It's just that now you're familiar with the distance, and because you're familiar with it and you know what to expect, it is more definable for you. And I get that that's the problem partially with cliffhangers. What I'm saying is, I don't mind them. I don't mind some threads not being fully woven in from one season to the next. I think that's what makes it easier to pick them up the next season and, provide a sense of continuity and familiarity between seasons 1 and 2. Game of Thrones also didn't always weave in all of the threads as it went along, and neither did Stargate SG-1. Now, I love both of those shows, and I have problems with each of them in their own way for things that I felt weren't tied up to my satisfaction, but other folks are totally satisfied with it. So as much as people are giving V-Wars a hard time about this one thing, I just want to adamantly say this doesn't bother me, and I actually really enjoy it in my shows, even if I have to wait a little longer to really get that payoff. It's a lesson in delayed gratification, y'all, and that's something that I think we all may become a lot more accustomed to in the COVID-19 era. We're going to go on a quick break, and when we come back, we are going to talk about the last names of the Dubovs and how this process of sorting out a peace treaty is going. Stay tuned.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
As to who did really join them for this historic peace treaty between vampires and humans has turned out to be Jimmy and Kaylee, and how I'm really a fan of it. I'm liking this intersection of these four characters. I think it makes for a richer story, and I just also love getting to see different characters through different characters' eyes. The more pairs of eyes we get to see them through, the more interesting and multidimensional the character really seems to be, especially if they're not necessarily beloved by all, or they're closer to some characters than they are to others. And I like this friendship that seems to be forming between Kaylee and Jimmy, and how they have a similar sense of humor and are also very gritty. It's cute, not necessarily in a shippy way, but also, now that I say that out loud, maybe in a shippy way. But I just generally like how compatible they are in their personalities. They have a lot in common with their personalities, even if they have chosen different outlets, like government work and being in the media, in order to go about doing what they think is the right thing to do. Jimmy does the right thing no matter what. Even though it meant he might have compromised his cover, he wasn't going to kill that guy that Bobby told him to kill, even though the guy was also in that motorcycle club that was apparently doing bad enough things to be infiltrated or to warrant him being assigned undercover there. So, there were federal resources and funds being spent to put him there. If nothing else, that is something that the government understands. Money, I suppose, for, getting people to do what they want and finding those means to ends. So they cared enough about what these people were doing to at least assign Jimmy to it. So the guy probably did something pretty bad, but Jimmy was still like, hey, I'm not going to take a life outside of the law. Jimmy's D&D alignment appears to be fairly straightforward. He's there to do the right thing, the moral thing. And Kaylee also feels that she's doing the right thing, the moral thing, in her own way. Remember that morality and legality are not necessarily the same things. And that's what we're seeing Jimmy kind of discover with Luther, even as Jimmy tries to adhere to making sure that he does still choose the right thing. He lets Danica go. He could have gone ahead and killed her. No one else would have held him accountable for it by any means. But Jimmy also understands that just because she's different doesn't necessarily mean that she's inherently evil. So Jimmy is finding him questioning these types of things. He's finding himself questioning these things, even as Kaylee is wrestling with her own sense of morality and vulnerability in the wake of losing Jurgen to Niklos having DNS shoot them. I almost said DHS, but they're called DNS in this TV show. Just because a lot of people consider certain acts that are moral to also be something that warrants being illegal, that doesn't necessarily mean that all immoral behavior or activities are illegal or that they should be, and vice versa. A lot of terrible things that have been done over the years have been legal to do so. So just because something's legal doesn't mean that it's moral. And that's where we find Jimmy and Kaylee agreeing, even if they're kind of approaching it from different perspectives and different processes. I also want to talk about the concept of Danica and Mila's last names in this episode, and also what that could really mean from an anthropological perspective, as well as from a genetic perspective. We've talked about the genetics and epigenetics of this in previous episodes, but in anthropology, a lot of times we can't fully get a hold of a lot of genetic data, especially if it's something that would require us digging up the grave of someone's loved one to obtain a DNA sample from their bones or other parts of their body, or if someone has a specific religious or cultural background or belief system that will not allow for them to give up any of the parts of their body and still obtain their religious and cultural goals. So there are a couple different reasons that you might not have access to that. Perhaps something just happened to an entire population, like, say, the population of Roanoke, and you're not able to get any of their DNA, so you can't trace it throughout a region and see what really happened to these individuals by using mitochondrial DNA or something. There's not always a way to get a hold of that. So for whatever reason, whether it be historical or cultural or religious, or just not physically having access to something, whether you don't know where it is or it's just gone and destroyed for all intents and purposes. So in those situations, anthropologists often use a type of data that we refer to as being population history. It's not just anthropologists that use this, though. A lot of biologists use it. So you're looking at the historical population demographics and differences of a group. You're looking at their population structure, and you're looking also at the history. Was there an influx of certain individuals who came into the area at different times? You're looking at human migration. And one way that you can tell that is by knowing whether a society tends to be more matriarchal or stereotypically patriarchal. And in that way, learn about name associations and who is the person who takes the names, who lives with whom after a wedding has occurred, who is considered to be the new family and who gets to keep parts of the old family. And by that I mean customs like how the parents will always go and live with the oldest son in some cultures, or the daughter has to leave her parents behind because they're no longer considered to be her family because she has a new last name. Things like that. There are so many different cultural practices around the world, so these are just a few of the examples. But my point is that last names have often been used, historically, to help track populations of people, to tell if people are related to each other as well, and just to help assign meaning to the world around us. And Danica and Mila both have the last name Dubov. They are sisters, and we know that they at least have their mother in common. And it seems that because of the association with Verdilaks and the Slavic folklore vampires, that we are supposed to be inferring that they are biologically related. Just because of the history of the Verdilak in folklore, and also the poem by Alexander Pushkin on the Verdilak. So the poem that he wrote was about Slavic folklore vampires that were called Verdilaks. We discussed them in previous episodes. And they are indeed Slavic in nature. Danica and Mila's last name, Dubov, is Russian in origin, according to the research that I conducted this past week. And they are indeed considered to be Slavic. So Verdilaks are perhaps not only just a genetic trait, but also one that could be tracked reasonably or predicted reasonably by using individuals' last names. This is something that we use in science and social science. And I think that even though Luther has really good intentions with Teresa in trying to hide the evidence of that NH47 gene, it also seems to be a little arrogant, as though just because the DNS and the government don't know about the NH47 gene right now, that they're not going to, just because Luther is maybe the only person in the world, along with Teresa, who is able to figure this out. This seems like pretty basic types of correlations. And in this case, if it was this apparent, even with as little data as Teresa had at the time, like 4 individuals, it seems that there is a definite and not all that difficult to find type of pattern going on here. And I think that any anthropologist who might be assigned to this, were they to assign an anthropologist, would be able to figure this out fairly quickly, even if they are not familiar with DNA specifically, or not super adept at DNA analysis, but at least familiar with it, that they would be able to see this. So my point is that that information kind of pops out at you, since last names are largely also about shared genes, and they're meant to help you understand the association of genes, is what they are when you boil it down. Then even if they don't know about the NH47 gene, it's going to be apparent at some point that siblings are being turned. And it may also become apparent that siblings are more likely to be Verdilaks, or that Verdilaks are more likely to be siblings or be in the same family, since the Verdilak in Alexander Pushkin's tales were likely to turn and then feel compelled to turn their other family members specifically. So that may be something that could be used against them too, that could be used to predict the prevalence or ratio or likelihood of whether a person, if infected, is more likely to be a blood or a Verdilak. So you could see if they were perhaps likely to turn and just go, okay, vampire at all, or specifically go, okay, not just a vampire, but a blood versus a Verdilak. Anthropology has been used in the past to assist many different atrocities by hazarding guesses on people's brain sizes in relation to the sizes of their skull, etc. And this is why this stuck out to me as a very dubious implication for anthropology-assisted atrocities in general, and how it has been done in the past. Art imitates life, and sometimes vice versa. So I'm wondering, with all of these parallels with modern day problems in V-Wars, if maybe something like that may pop up in the future of this series. So one of the other thoughts that I had about that is in regards to snakes. Snakes and any other type of creature that may be venomous, like spiders of some species, etc., are sometimes milked in order to make anti-venoms to their venom. And that got me to thinking that perhaps if they're able to tell the difference between Bloods and Verdilaks, specifically as it comes to the vampires within V-Wars, whether that is by predicting it with their last names or by testing their DNA, that they may be inclined to weaponize some of this or politicize some of this Verdilak venom. We're going to go on a quick break, and when we come back, I'm going to talk about this concept. Stay tuned.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blanks and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
Welcome back. Before the break, we were talking about the concepts of population history and population structure to answer questions about the world around us in reference to history, or even predicting future events or the prevalence of a certain disease or the likelihood of getting it based off of shared genetics being indicated or implied by certain regional last names. So, for example, in the last segment, I mentioned that the Verdilaks are Slavic folklore vampires, and that Mila and Danica, who are both Verdilaks in this show, also have the Slavic last name of Dubov. So, in this way, we might be able to track the vampires or predict who might be a Verdilak. And since we are portraying the DNS as being super evil already, I thought of how perhaps they might intentionally then cultivate Verdilaks in order to milk them or harvest them, either to make an anti-venom against this venom that is making you addicted to being fed on by the vampires, or being addicted to the venom itself, the injections of it that you receive while feeding. It acts like heroin, as we've discussed in the past, and whether they would make like an anti-venom to that to prevent people from being subjected to that addiction to begin with, or whether they would use it to try to make people more docile, like their constituents. Who's to say? What happens if you expose a blood to it? I'm not quite sure yet. I guess we will see, or we won't. I wasn't paying as much attention to the scenes with Danica and Michael as I perhaps should have been in order to be able to answer that question. But what can I say? The question just popped into my head. I don't know if she bit him the way that she did and fed on the first boyfriend right after she turned. I digress. I think, though, that we're seeing something really dark building here. And it's extra interesting because the characters are letting us know that a lot of them aren't sure if there is a clear villain or hero or a good or evil side just based solely off of someone's genetic makeup or their epigenetics in their expression at this time. So as we see this happening, I can totally see DNS just going crazy with this. We already see that Niklos has called the head of the committee that they were sitting with and let him know, hey, find a less obvious scapegoat than me when this all requires that you have one. And he's essentially asking for a favor, but the guy's not likely to give it to him, and also he knows that. So it's part warning, part request on both sides, more or less. And in this case, Niklos goes off, and we see that he's already doing some full Resident Evil extinction stuff. He has some of that material that has the blood in it, or that has the material, the prions that are going to turn him. But it looks like he has some kind of super serum that is a lot closer to what goes on in Resident Evil Extinction with the super zombie type of deal. Niklos believes that this is the next step in human evolution, and he is in someone's basement. It really looks like legitimately somebody's basement, getting injected with this mysterious fluid that we know is going to do a bad thing. He's getting an IV that's getting like some of the blood injected in there. And even the doctor is telling him, hey, I know I'm a guy in a basement doing procedures, but even I have to say this is maybe really inadvisable. But Niklos is going to do it anyway. So he's already wanting to be even stronger and have more power right now, and he already feels backed against a wall. He doesn't want to be the scapegoat for this, so he's doing what he has to survive. And he's going to take that material, but he also seems super gleeful and excited about it. So now I can definitely see them taking this to a militaristic or politicized level of this Verdilak venom. I also thought that maybe they might use it to create a more docile population. So that made me think of the use of PAX in Serenity, in which they exposed everyone to that in the air. And most people just got so lazy that they laid down and died. But the other people reacted very violently. They had the adverse reaction and became super duper violent instead of more docile, like extremely violent and almost inhuman or perhaps extra human in their aggression. And in that situation, I could see maybe that happening with DNS. I could see a plot line kind of like that, where they maybe try to introduce Verdilak venom into different products to get people to use it more. That might be just more capitalism in general, but you know, if someone could commercialize that, if V-Wars had a baby with the boys, I could totally see them injecting Verdilak venom into different products to get people more addicted to it. Just to just hold some kind of political sway over folks, or some sort of sway in general. It's like previous theorized CIA ops or interactions with foreign dignitaries. These are things that this Verdilak venom could be used for in these different stories, particularly if this was crossed over with The Boys. I like the show on its own, but y'all know I also really love The Boys, and I can see a lot of crossover potential here. But you know, there's also a lot of other problems, like we don't have superheroes specifically in V-Wars, so that would be kind of jarring for them. It's less upsetting, theoretically, in V-Wars for there to be vampires if it's set in the Boys universe, because at least there's already vampires, so people would probably at first just think they were superheroes anyway, and not be all that upset about it. Can the superheroes dispose of the vampires? I don't know. But now I'm just getting into fanfiction territory. It got away from me there for a second. But I like to think about these different scenarios, and I can totally see them using Verdilak venom for this. I also think that there's a really gross and ethically contemptible situation in which this government with DNS and Nikos and everyone might milk the Verdilaks for their venom, like they do in some of those vampiric collections of human blood sacs, where they keep people alive and just keep harvesting their blood from them in order to eat, like a food supply, almost like how we farm cattle nowadays. And I could see them doing that, although the Verdilak venom in this case would not be a form of sustenance like the cows or like the human blood sacs are in some vampire movies, but rather as maybe being a drug. I could see people trying to adjust that the way that they have cocaine and stuff. So you have lidocaine and novocaine, these numbing agents. Maybe they could use it medically, but maybe, much more likely, they would use it as drugs or ways to get money. So stripping it down or processing it further so that it acts like maybe a super heroin, but without being as likely to kill a person, or without getting you addicted to the feeding itself, if you could just take it on your own. Maybe that could make people less likely to be fed upon by vampires, or maybe it would just still work a strawberry style, like we discussed previous episodes, about how vampires might just start dealing their own Verdilak venom and getting people addicted so that then they could come to them or have them be forced to come to them in order to get that hit. It is really grim in these considerations on all sides, whether it's the Verdilaks doing this to the humans or the humans farming Verdilaks in order to take their venom for these different reasons. I can also see Verdilak venom as having a lot of potential depth to it. I don't know how far they would want to take the venom thing, but if it's like snake venom or other types of non-human animal venom in which it's more potent when it's released easier, or it's released easier in juveniles. So you know what I mean, like when little snakes and other types of animals that are venomous are very small, they're more likely to release all their venom at once. They haven't learned how to control it and what the dosage is really. And so I wonder about Verdilak venom. We haven't seen any child vampires yet. We don't know if maybe Danica's venom gets stronger as she ages, like something might in the originals, or whether it gets weaker as she ages, like in the Twilight rules. We'll see what children are like in this. Maybe. Who knows? Are vampires sterile? We don't know yet. Maybe that's something we will see in the next episode or the next season. I am hoping to at least find out a little bit more about what happens when children are turned into vampires, because we do get a look at that in this episode, even if we don't get to see vampire children being made the good old-fashioned way. I just have a lot of questions here, but I do also think that given the amount of correlations that are present for the show and the current modern day American climate, sociopolitically, culturally, biologically, everything that's going on right now has a lot of strong allegories in V-Wars. And so I could see, as folks are more and more concerned with fascism, perhaps seeing something like the Verdilaks, like maybe everything happening simultaneously. People are complex, and not everyone's going to react to these situations exactly the same. So maybe you would have Verdilaks selling their own venom in order to get people hooked initially. Maybe you would simultaneously see that and the government trying to militarize it or politicize it, or even perform that double ethical violation of possibly breeding Verdilaks. However that works, whether that is young ones being created with, insemination and genetics, or whether that is just turning children or turning new people in order to process and really collect more of that Verdilak venom. It's kind of a eugenics breeding program at that time. It is based on their genes, even if it's epigenetics, and it's very grim. Those are some potential places I see the show going in the future, or at least plot points that I think would be really interesting for me to see. However, it may just end up being some good ideas for fan fiction. So if you write fan fiction and you're interested in taking that somewhere, I would be interested in reading it, because my mind went wild thinking about that this week as I went out in the area that I grew up in, deep in the woods and in the mountains, and looked for animals to help out before and after the rains this week. We had a lot of herptiles, some, snakes, and also turtles and everything crossing the road to go and either take advantage of that moisture to do, their turtle business. It's their business. Or also to just warm themselves up on the pavement after the rainstorm had cooled them off, because they need that environmental heat. I went out to drive around and check on them, and we found some turtles that were doing really well. We found some snakes that were doing well, and also some that we were not able to save this week. So I also just wanted to mention the snakes and the turtles. Not that I'm saying turtles are venomous. I'm talking about the snakes. But my point is that I clearly had reptiles and amphibians strongly on my mind this week, and how different types of animal venom have been politicized and weaponized over the years, and how we also use it in medicine. And thinking about that so heavily this week, as we've had a ton of storms, really also made me think about how that applied to V-Wars. So if you're interested in these plot points, hit me up on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, because I would love to be able to read it when you go to write it. I think the human imagination is a wonderful thing, and no matter where V-Wars takes this in the future, I am excited to watch it. Now that really only gets us all the way about halfway so, or through season 1, episode 9, but we will finish that episode in our next Monday podcast. For now, enjoy those considerations that may be future plot points, or may just be fanfiction plot bunnies. Either way, thank you for listening to the GSMC Sci-Fi podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sci-Fi Network. I'd like to ask that you please subscribe to the show, and writing a nice review always really helps us. Also, if you could please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, I'd appreciate it. Thank you kindly, and have a good night.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.